Okay, I'm going to actually stop sharing the screen now so that we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Santa Rosa Zine Fest 2023. The Sonoma County Library is thrilled to be partnering again with the Santa Rosa Zine Collective to bring you this year's Zine Fest. So we have an absolutely incredible, oh, sorry, one second. It looks like we might have an issue with the chat. So we're going to work on getting that chat going. Sorry about that. We will see what we can do about that. And as we're doing that, just want to again welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today. We have an incredible lineup of virtual and in-person events throughout the week. We're very excited to kick it all off with this conversation about zines, RPGs, and play. But before we get started, we'd like to just go over a few details about how this session is going to work. So if you have questions for our presenters, we're going to ask that you use the Q&A function. And so that way we're hoping we can get the chat going. We're not quite sure what happened with that, but we have some people working on the back end for that. And okay, looks like it may be working now. Great. Excellent, thank you. Okay, awesome. So yeah, feel free to use the chat. We love to have comments and feedback in there. That's fantastic. But if you do have specific questions that you want to make sure get addressed, please put those in the Q&A. We also are very grateful to have ASL interpretation today. So we have Glory here joining us. So we're very grateful to have them. We did discover that there may be a little bit of an issue once we start sharing slides. It may be difficult if you're on a tablet or a phone to see the interpretation at the same time that the slides are shared. So we wanted to let you all know that if you're able to switch over to a computer, you will probably have better luck with being able to see the interpretation and the speakers and the slides. We are recording this session, and the recording should display everything as we wanted, but unfortunately we did run into this little issue with Zoom. So also, if you are in a room with a group of people, maybe you're in a classroom or just a group of friends hanging out together, we would love for you to comment in the chat and let us know how many people are joining you and where you're Zooming in from. And as I mentioned, this session will be recorded. It'll be posted to YouTube in probably about a week. And we'll be sure to share that with everyone who registered for the event. So now I'm very happy to turn things over to Chelsea from Santa Rosa Zine Collective to introduce our amazing presenters. Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Tara. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be back with Santa Rosa Zine Fest again with all of you folks. I think some folks are people that I don't know, and there's definitely some friends and returning people I recognize in the chat. So it's a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm going to introduce the panelists who are going to be talking today in conversation about play and performance and role-playing games and how zines fit into that whole world. I will start with Patrick Michael Ballard, whose pronouns are he and they. Patrick was the noun that made their face you true. Born from the spit and bile and dirt and rust and plastic and churning fields of gibberish, an art was birthed into the cess-like diagram of profession. One he will now try to wear for you, even though it hurts. Patrick Michael Ballard is an artist casting effective atmospheres for tuning collective story organs, employing nonsensical sculpture divinations, neological weirdings of poetry and pedantry in equal measure, psychomagical parlor games, puppetry, and performance works doo-doo, a theater of impossible selves under regimes of object permanence. Many forms sputter out. Watch them go. And before I introduce Sam, I want to just share that Patrick is kind of the entry point to this conversation for me. I love tabletop role-playing games and came to them from a storytelling background, not from the entry point that a lot of people do with like Dungeons and Dragons, for example. But I started thinking about trying to bring together a conversation of people who could speak to the relationship between games and zines. I knew a handful of people who had self-published games that were zines. Um, and Patrick was one of the people who came to my mind. We've known each other for over a decade now, and I've been a fan of their art for a long time. And with my friend Ron, who's in the chat, one of the most pleasurable art experiences I've gotten to have was going to a performance that Patrick did several years ago in Los Angeles, which was based on an escape room idea. It was really surreal. It was called Return to Forever House, and Patrick played dozens of roles and had created puppets and just a completely transformed world that you could step into. And Patrick stepped into those various roles night after night to bring Return to Forever House to life for people who bought tickets to come and interact like you would with any escape room that maybe isn't thought of in such an artful way. So Patrick came to mind when they started teaching at UC Santa Cruz, a class about play. And we got in touch to talk about whether there could be a conversation here. And that was when Patrick said that he really thought that talking to his friend Sam would make the conversation richer. So we're super thrilled to bring Sam Malabre to the conversation. Sam's pronouns are they, them. Sam Malabre is a staff member at the UCLA Games Lab, where they run and research independent tabletop role-playing games. At the lab, they also teach game design at the Game Lab High School Summer Institute, and they work on initiatives to acquire and archive indie and experimental games for use in classes and research. Their own work contends with the US imperialist imaginary, escapist fantasy, and how the two intersect. They work in a variety of media, conference presentation, video essay, and digital tabletop games. So without further ado, we will bring Sam and Patrick together. I'll go away for a little while and I'll let you two take it away.
Hi, everyone. Patrick, should I start sharing my screen?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool.
Yeah, thanks everyone for showing up. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Chelsea. And yeah, why don't we have some slides to share and maybe some other things. And yeah, this is kind of like, yeah, as Chelsea mentioned, me and Sam met through the UCLA Game Lab. But now I'm up here in Northern California and kind of like, you know, within kind of the gravity, the psychological gravity of the Santa Rosa Zine Fest. So we're excited to be here and connect and share some of our conversation with y'all.
Yeah, thank you for that intro, Patrick, and thank you, Chelsea. So basically, Patrick and I are going to switch off a little bit. I'm going to start us off talking about role-playing games, zines, and a tabletop role-playing. So I want to start with, as sort of Chelsea mentioned, Dungeons and Dragons, which is like a very, which is kind of like the beginning of the role-playing game hobby in the US and kind of the modern day. So role-playing games kind of started out of numerous different like wargaming practices. Basically, there were all these different groups of wargamers spread all across the country, mostly like in the US and then in Great Britain. And kind of simultaneously, like in the 60s and 70s, like a lot of them switched to playing in a way where they would play as a single character instead of, say, like the commander of like a whole army. And so there were all these play practices of kind of like a start of role playing that was happening all over the place. And Dungeons and Dragons kind of comes out of that, and it comes out of it as 3 sort of staple bound zines about fantasy role playing, and that kind of like give the procedures of how you might do this kind of play, where you're playing as a single character, where you're telling stories with your friends with dice, etc. And so I think it's really important to just like stress that like this was a thing that was happening in play. It was a play practice that was going on, and then the publication of this game book kind of like centered that culture and like allowed there to be more kind of a community and people talking about playing in this way, essentially. So one of the ways that these kind of conversations around sort of early role-playing games sort of happened is also through the medium like of zines. So basically, there were these things called APAs, which stands for Amateur Press Associations, which were basically like one person would have a zine, other people would submit kind of articles, new games, writing, etc. to it, and then they would send it out to subscribers via the mail. And so in the kind of like early days of this fantasy role-playing game hobby, that's how a lot of these conversations were happening. And that these zines really widen that hobby. There's like, for like Dungeons and Dragons, it's obviously this kind of like very, you know, a traditional Western fantasy. It's coming out of this wargaming space, so it tends to be very sort of male dominated, etc. And so these sort of APA zines widened that space a lot and brought in a lot of other different people to this kind of burgeoning hobby of tabletop role playing. So on the West Coast, for example, like in LA, a lot of people who were in a kind of sci-fi and fantasy fandom for like sci-fi and fantasy fiction, they started playing Xeroxed copies of like Dungeons and Dragons, because those first zines, there were only like maybe like a couple hundred of them printed. So most people were playing off of Xeroxed copies of their friend or game club zines. So that zine culture helped grow that space. Like in LA, there was this one of these APA zines was called Alarms and Excursions. And it's been running since 1975. And it was a space where this sci-fi fantasy fandom, a lot more women than the kind of wargaming scene that started D&D were able to kind of like enter this culture through there. Now I'm going to talk, just kind of like show y'all a lot of different role-playing game zines that are being made very recently. But we're going to maybe start this conversation, and Patrick's going to add to it with thinking about kind of like what can a game text do, right? So you are a person who is playing things, you want to share play with people, and you're going to make a text or a zine or a book, and you're going to give it to other people. And like, what does that action mean? What is that action doing? And there's a lot of things that like a game book or game zine could do. It can document play practices, right? So the early version of D&D kind of documented this kind of play that was already happening in people's like scratched and scribbled notes, and it shared it with more people. These APA zines sort of allowed people to communicate about the play that they were doing, the play that was happening, and to discuss new forms of play, new ideas of what play would mean. Games can expose readers to new possibilities of play, etc.
I just wanted to jump in, Sam, and I think that something that just gets taken for granted because we can, you know, from like an experiment in behavior, like kind of just like, you know, wanting to bring a type of a feeling or a type of way of expressing ourselves around the kitchen table so that we can present it to our friends in the course of play. Like each player and what they desire from that experience would bring in experimental techniques, right? So before they even became practices, like if I'm a person, you know, who loves to make like little tiny objects and kind of wants to bring them, I play through the act of making things, and I want to bring like a little tiny red door, you know, into my like kitchen tabletop scene to add some kind of like like theatrical dimension, that play is something which is a lot more like atmospheric and effervescent, you know, in the same way that like, you know, cosmic spaces form from dust and then grow compact by the forces of gravity, spinning heat and all of that, that play so too is kind of cosmically shaped before it kind of crystallizes even into a practice, before it crystallizes into like a set of rules that then create mechanics, right? We haven't even got that far in this presentation yet, but like a play practice is sometimes just getting together with people with an intention and sitting around and figuring out like, what are the limits of how we can behave in that space? And so play is something that's always kind of bubbling through and sifting through and kind of washing over our minds. Sometimes we, you know, even think to play with a word while we're playing, and that becomes a whole new separate game that kind of emerges. So I just like to unpack that idea of play especially when we're thinking about sitting around a table with friends and being an individual in that space and trying to see ourselves in that space before we've even decided upon practices or those things start to crystallize in some way.
Yeah, no, totally. I think that like, I'm going to be showing a lot of like cool books, but I think that, as kind of Patrick said, I think that like play cannot be captured in a text. It can do a lot of things around a book. Books can inspire like a lot of things, but there's so much that happens just at that table with a few people, and whatever they bring to it. A book is just one thing they could bring to it, right? A zine is just one thing they could bring to play. And yeah, so like they're sort of one tiny element, and they're one that we see a lot and is very important to history because of the kind of way we elevate books and texts. But I think that play is so many things when it's at a table with a group of people. Okay, so I'm going to talk about probably first the biggest self-published role-playing game book maybe ever. So this is a book by Tim Hutchings. It's a game where the rules are basically one person is playing as like an astronaut, and all the other group of players are voices that astronaut is hearing over the radio, who are explaining to them how to fix like technological doodads on the moon that the group makes up as they're playing this game. I think this really huge, massive book, like you can see this pen here, like this is a 1,200 page book. Is a really good example of things a game text could do, because one page contains those game rules that I kind of just explained to you. 9 pages contain advice from the author on how to play this game, how to come up with fun technologies, other things you could do with this game. Maybe you want to make it about a heist, or you want to make it about being on the moon, or you want to make it about fixing things undersea or on an oil rig or whatever. So advice, communication from the author. 13 pages contain some like useful prompts, and then there's 1,177 pages of NASA documents that could maybe inspire your ideas of weird technological things you could come up with. You could flip through those documents, find a word that you don't know what it means, and you could bring it to play. It's like, oh, you need to fix this spanner or whatever it is. We can also flip through this book at the QA. I like have it, and it's actually falling apart a little bit because it's so large that like the binding like can't really hold it. It's a huge book.
I also, Sam, I just want to add, like, I'm so kind of glad that you started with this one, because there's kind of like this other level of play that's going on here, which is that often when we think about like a zine or even a self-published role-playing game, it's kind of like how concise can I be? How can I offer over someone this world without like overburdening them with information? And even in like Chelsea's, when Chelsea read my bio, that idea of like performative pedantry. And so like thinking about this game as almost being like giving you all this fodder to kind of like role play with real technobabble, like, and that like trying to make that as real as possible, but that like over 1,000 pages are dedicated to just that fodder is kind of like this act of like kind of like maximalist play that you don't really see in a lot of game texts, almost to like this level of granularity, which is like overwhelming, you know, to the point where no one would even attempt to read this book cover to cover, nor is that the point of it, you know? And so it's kind of absurd in its nature.
Yeah, yes, exactly. And in this way, the book is kind of like playing with you by being how absurd it is. So I'm going to try to go a little quicker here, just show like a couple more things that we could look more in depth later during the Q&A. So 1,000 Islands is this series of zines. It's by Zidek and Munkau. They're these zines where each of them is a fantasy location, an island, a forest, various other places, a like road or a trade route. They are inspired by Southeast Asia, history, myth, and the lived experiences of the author and the illustrator. Each zine is one single place. Zidek has said in other talks that in order to make a map of 1,000 Islands, you should throw all of your zines on the floor. There are no like formal rules in these zines. It's all done with prose writing and with these like really beautiful sort of black and white illustrations that I feel like are very kind of like, you know, they're very grounded, right? They really give this space like a feeling of like being real and that you could kind of see yourself there. There's a lot of things that are kind of interesting with how 1,000 Islands pushes back on some of the ideas of fantasy that are contained like in Dungeons and Dragons. One of them is that in like 1,000 Islands, this idea of like a taxonomy that's present in D&D, like there are specific categories of creatures and monsters, and there's demons and devils, and those are very specific different things, like how science would classify them. In 1,000 Islands, a crocodile could be a god, a person, a city, an island, or any combination of those things. Like to even say they could be a god is not really like, that's already putting a classification on it. And so in these zines, it's kind of much more complex than that. I did just want to very briefly read like a section of writing from this. This is the way into the forest. There's basically these two trees that enter into this forest. The left-hand tree is dead. The right-hand tree is in permanent flower. Walking between them, your ears pop. They were blocked all your life. You just never knew better. If you fell either tree, the way to the forest shuts like a refrigerator door. Which I think gives like a really good example of how these zines do rules just through language, right? Of describing a place or a world to you. And so you can like try to like imagine or play within it yourself. The last kind of game I'm going to specifically call out is this storytelling and map drawing game called Echo by Kai Po. In it, basically, like one of the players is the data ghost of a long dead mech pilot, and the other people play children who find them. You basically draw maps and tell stories based off of these other ruined places you discover like in a journey. It's based on the author's experience of finding the wreckage of a World War II a Japanese plane in a forest near where he grew up. And these are all sort of artifacts of play that were made by people who are playing this at the Game Lab. So this is their map and some sketches, and I think that that kind of speaks to what Patrick was saying earlier about kind of like the different things that people are bringing into play, and also the different things that might be created out of your own play. Lastly, I'm just going to very quickly talk about one of my own games, and I want to turn it over to Patrick after this. So this is a game that I made. It's like a 2-page zine. It's called Dust Knights. In it, you play as Dust Mite Knights. The kind of twist of the game is that the world of the game is your house, the place where you're playing the game. And basically, as you play the game, you move through your house following your little tiny Dust Mite Knights, measuring their movements with the edge of the rule book. It's inspired by my very like unscientific research into dust mites and kind of like speculating what it would be like to be so small. It's also inspired by kind of like, to kind of tie it back to some of those things we were talking about with Dungeons and Dragons, these kind of old war game ideas of you kind of play with whatever you had, like you use stacks of books to represent buildings, that kind of made those things like more maybe childlike or sort of like accessible than they are now when they're super commercialized. Basically, the world of those games, in sort of Dust Knights, the world of the game, the fictional world of the game, is your own physical surroundings, and kind of what does that do in play? I have a whole big list of other zines here. At the end of the talk, we can maybe come back to this slide if people want to take a look at some of these things more, but I want to get to Patrick now.
Hi, thanks so much for that, Sam. I love like listening through how you think about games and game texts and where they kind of cross over into some of these more experimental kind of cultures of play and performance. And the one thing that I love about, you kind of finishing on Dust Knights, your piece, is that when I encountered that zine and that kind of piece, the one thing that really stuck out to me was, I'm going to jump into this slide here. I'm just giving a little oh wait, go back. A little preamble. But yeah, is how and in what way game text can help us remap the everyday, so that then we start having like different and playful relationships to it. Like that a stack of books is no longer now a stack of books, but I have this new way of orienting myself towards it so that I'm actually experiencing dimensions of those books that I wouldn't normally think about. Like kind of like divots on their spine might suddenly be like jokingly referred to as a crack in the side of the building or something like that. And these spaces of play start allowing our mind to become a little bit more malleable. Now, as Chelsea mentioned, the way that they came to the space of the zine game was through storytelling. And Sam is talking about it through this lens of like the history of tabletop role-playing games. The way that I come to this idea of like a play-based text is kind of through the realms of performance art, and how I came to role-playing and storytelling through performance art, through artist-made texts and artist-made books, with this idea of them being scores for play and expanding thought. So here, this slide, we're looking at what was ultimately a compilation. The musician composer Lamont Young and Jackson McLough in New York in the 1960s basically created this compilation of all of these techniques that were being used by artists, game makers, even performers, for basically anything that was using chance-based operations. So meaning like when we roll a dice at the tabletop role-playing table, that becomes a chanced operation, where there's these kind of systems where we utilize some sort of chaos in order to make a decision, or even Zedek's suggestion of throwing all of your zines on the floor in order to map the space. That again is hearkening back to this idea, the idea of a chance-based operation. And these often are these things that get included in our games so that they're unpredictable. That like what other people bring to the table is unpredictable. What we can expect from them, that there's a structure of unpredictability, so we know kind of how to move through uncertainty. And I find that this topic is explicitly really powerful right now because we are in a world of deep uncertainty on so many levels. And as our world, socio-political and ecological, and even the politics of identity are under this kind of duress and existential reckoning, that throughout history during those periods, rule-based experiences rooted in text seem to bubble to the surface as really powerful mediums, particularly in hyper-local populations. So right here, Lamont Young did his best to compile all of these techniques that were being used internationally by composers and different players of different kinds. And this one that I put here called card piece is a way in which you can use a card deck in a group of people to structure a choral ensemble, even of non-singers, so that you can all make an extremely weird and unusual tapestry of sound together. And I paired that with this game called The Quiet Year, which also uses a traditional card deck to structure with 52 cards in it, the 52 weeks of a year in preparing for a major disaster, which you as a collective civilization will encounter over the course of this year, and kind of think about how and in what way you're behaving ethically or unethically, mapping the space of this world that you're co-creating with drawing. And so there's this kind of interesting way in which this traditional card deck through a game text can be utilized in radically different ways. Now let's go to the next slide. So in come the Fluxus movement in the late 60s. And from the early to the late 60s, we see all of these artists who are stepping away from tradition because the world is topsy-turvy, it's helter-skelter. And they're trying to make a new kind of nonsense out of how absurd and nonsensical our world is. Just like the surrealists did in the 20s and 30s during the World War, and just like the Dadaists did. And so we see a lot of these techniques of chance and absurdity start flooding into these kind of text-based spaces, because something to think about is, how do I share a fully embodied experience, a transformative experience of being in my house and pretending that I'm a dust mite pre-internet with someone who's in another country? So that's when, like, all of a sudden artists published books, or artists made handmade books and zines, like printmaking and short run, small kind of like collections of ideas start getting transmitted internationally. And then enters the rise of mail art, the artist made book, and all of these things. And so here we're looking at, on this slide, we have a couple different scores. They're kind of scores for experiences to be more playful with how and in what way we perceive our everyday life. So how and in what way art, just by being a set of instructions, can cause us to tune to our own reality in a new way. Now, this is different than some of the narratives that we go to texts for. Sometimes we go to a narrative and a text in order to like remove ourselves from everyday life. These are about going into the text to actually reflect something and change something about your life and in your world. So I'll just kind of run, so these are kind of like proposals for activities, kind of rules for an experience. And let's go to the next slide. I don't want to stay too long on that one, but the influxus, this idea of the score was really powerful. Now, as these ideas about scores became powerful, they started to cross over into kind of poetry even. And one of the more kind of like well-known artists made books that was like this series of individual pamphlet poems, originally was made by Yoko Ono, who was a Fluxus artist and in part of that kind of international movement. And they made this book called Grapefruit that was a series of instructions. And some of these instructions, they're named like pieces. And these pieces are things that you could carry out in your everyday life. And in carrying these out, the game is about shifting your normal experience. So they're almost like games that we play with ourselves and in the social space. And I'll read one of them here. But what I think of what's so interesting about Yoko's writing in these is that sometimes they seem like very obtuse or even like impossible to perform. And that becomes this space where the poetry of how and in what way do we actually shift our own perspective so that we can perform the text in some way? You know, like how and in what way I define some of these words is what limits whether or not it's even performable. So I'll read this one called Conversation Piece, just so you can kind of get a sense for, of how these might play out. So in Conversation Piece, it says, bandage any part of your body. If people ask about it, make a story and tell. If people do not ask about it, draw their attention to it and tell. If people forget about it, remind them of it and keep telling. Do not talk about anything else. So it's kind of this way in which kind of like bringing this sort of like aesthetic gesture, which sometimes people will feel a little bit of social consciousness around, like someone's injury. It might be something that some people ask about, but in this particular piece, you're kind of being asked to aesthetically orchestrate that for yourself and play this kind of role play in your community in some way, or to experiment with that in the social fabric. Some of them get a lot more kind of poetic, like, you know, carry out this set of instructions and do it forever. And then the question of like, well, what does forever mean and how can I even do that kind of comes into the mix. Let's go to the next slide. Just want to be mindful of time too. Yeah, and this one's one of the more iconic ones. This one is also seen as kind of like this beginning of like completely score-based music, which is all text oriented. So traditional music might utilize specific notes telling specific players of instruments how and in what way to move their fingers. Whereas in these Fluxus scores, there was often this tremendous amount of room to interpret them. And so this one by George Brecht, which was written in 1962, called Drip Music. Anything that was not explicitly stated in the rules was up for interpretation. And the only thing in the rules for this piece was it's for single or multiple performance. So that means like it could happen successively. There could be more than one drip, making it more than a music. It could turn into a whole event. And then a source of dripping water and an empty vessel are arranged so that the water falls into the vessel. And that's all that's, so at one of these Fluxus events where all these scores have been passed around, the International Fluxus Organization would get together, and then there'd be this whole moment where in which George Brecht would get up and everyone having read that text and see how and in what way George Brecht performs the dripping of this water. And so he, in this particular instance, brought in a ladder, which was not utilized in the score. It never said you need to get on a ladder. And then, you know, and brought this big pail. And it doesn't say you need to use a pail, it just says a vessel. So these sort of, we start seeing how and in what way, as different people would perform these pieces and photograph themselves doing it, they would send it to George Brecht, and then you'd get this wild array of different ways in which people had thought about this almost like poetic way in which dripping is like part of the atmosphere of our life. But giving it so much potency and giving it so much attention almost makes it like absurd in its importance. And yet dripping is something. The reason why, you know, we have stalagmites and stalactites is because of dripping. You know, cave systems are formed out of dripping. And so it is a powerful and almost cosmically shaping event that should be given some space to think about. So let's go on. And there was also there's other words. I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but there was other words for these types of events. Artists started, instead of saying I'm a painter, they would say I'm a maker of happenings, or I'm a maker of movements, or I'm a maker of situations, right? So the words that they were using even to describe the art that they were making were being transmitted in these zines and these artist-made publications, and that they were starting like an event was different than a happening. And a happening was different than a movement. And a movement was different than a situation, because they were all coming out of their own local contexts. But just like all of these play practices were emerging at the time of D&D, kind of in tabletop role-playing, all being kind of sporadically emerging simultaneously, so too was this desire for greater degrees of almost atmospheric abstraction in what can art be and how can we use text to internationalize these new concepts. Let's go on. And then we start seeing people actually exploring games themselves in the way that they're thinking about systems of logic. because language itself operates by rules, and that there's poetry. Often we love poetry because it breaks those rules, you know, and it deliberately does that to create emotional effects. And so a lot of these Fluxus artists were thinking and looking at every structure in society and how could we intervene in order to create new types of ways of seeing, ways of using these tools to experience the world in new ways. And so Taiko Sato, she was this incredible Fluxus artist who is known for making a series of alterations on the chess game. So you have smell chess in its different forms at the top left. All of the pieces are correlated to particular smells. And instead of having colors as a way of denoting the differences between the two positions, and instead of having the form of the object be what denotes the different types of pieces, you have all of these unified and identical vials that one would have to smell in order to know whether or not it was a knight or a bishop, or to know whether or not it was a black piece or a white piece. And so then you had to work purely non-visually in order to remember the smell profiles and what they meant within the normal game of chess in order to operate this game. And what that did also was it kind of brought awareness around the way in which visual systems make some levels of ability in terms of accessing games also inaccessible, right? That like when one is relegated to only using smell to operate a logic system, that's often most games do not bring forward that feature. You know, they don't actually like prize alternate ways of sensing the world. And so Taiko Sato also developed spice chess, which is a similar thing. It's just not liquids. There's this one of the sound chess. So there's all these variations on chess. There's Yoko Ono also made an all-white chessboard, where in which like throughout the course of play, if you forget whose piece is what, that it ends up becoming this sort of stalemate of like pacifistic sort of engagement, where the more you move pieces, the more it becomes impossible to know how to compete, and you lose track of things. And so war is no longer possible. And it was kind of like this desire to create a game where complexity leads to pacifism instead of a winner. And then we go even further, and this is where games and play start really getting embedded in objects. George Masiunas was a Lithuanian artist who was really the one who wanted to, well, he would reach out to people internationally who he saw practicing play within their work, saw them, he created this, he's the one who coined the term Fluxus, flux meaning to flow. So it was kind of like an art form that was flowing internationally. And he would try to kind of bring legitimacy to this movement by doing these workshops where he'd put out calls to artists, and they would all submit these abstract and absurdist little games. And each one of these boxes, these flux boxes, which we're looking at here, this box with all these little papers and folds and zines and objects embedded within it. And each of them was contributed by a different one of these international artists, and would often, each one would have an experience with rules. And the person who got one of these boxes would be able to take it out and kind of experience all of these different sort of interactive ways of perceiving their reality and playing with themselves and others, creating events, sometimes working with optical systems or puzzles. And they're super diverse. Interestingly enough, Santa Cruz has a collection of them in their special collections, which I'm scheduled to go and check out. Like, so I'll be able to physically look at these things. But I think they're a beautiful model for thinking about how and in what way to also bring play pieces along with our texts and still make them kind of portable in this kind of zine-like ethic. So yeah, let's go next. Yeah, and so I was just going to share a little bit about what I do, maybe just for a couple minutes. I just wanted to briefly show, in making these kinds of experiential forms of play, I kind of bring together like this fantasy culture that we're talking about in D&D, the dungeon crawl, video game logic, but in bringing it into the real, there's some way in which I need to kind of make recipes for all of these objects if I want to kind of communicate them to other people so they too can make these narratives. And so ultimately, I end up making these almost like graphic novel-like sets of instructions for how to make and how to connect all of these different sculptural objects. So that door that I brought up is part of a game called as Goinenkainen, which we'll talk about. But here, this is a kind of graphic novel score for this escape room called Return to Forever House, just a couple pages from it. So why don't we go to the next slide? And this is kind of like the actual thing gets built all the way out into this like installation with architectural blueprints and characters. And I ended up playing all of the characters in this particular scenario with different scripts. But the players who came in would bring their own selves and tools to the table, and they would often re-script some moments within this sort of unfolding fantasy narrative. Here in this picture, I'm dressed as my teenage self, named Elmer, who I identified as during the MySpace days of social media, and I would go out and meet people as Elmer because I didn't feel like I could present myself as who I really was in my context, because there was a lot of kind of like that kind of like aggressive sport and kind of like bullying culture, kind of where I grew up. And so this character became this person and this entity that I would draw over and over again. And when I decided to make a game, I wanted them to be a part of that space, almost like as a way of honoring that avatar. Let's go on. So in thinking about this idea of making scores, I'm also thinking about ways of kind of helping people design tools which are highly unusual in order to figure out like how to play with the edges of game formation, and how to like even sometimes, you know, I think about like dowsing rods. You know, these are like these tools that were used on the frontier. They have kind of mystical origins, kind of like a stick, and that you would use them and kind of follow where the stick is trying to take you in order to kind of seek out water, in order to seek out something that's needed. And it was seen as this tool that helps us tune into our intuition by focusing our energy into it. And so play, in its most broadest storytelling and imaginary sense, are these kinds of ways that we kind of psychologically attune to each other when we're playing with other people. Or when we do it by ourselves, it's way we're like tuning to ourselves. But how many people are taught how many different ways they can play? How many people have, you know, been in an environment where they were given a bunch of Fluxus scores and or given a bunch of experimental tabletop role-playing game mechanics in order to kind of like see the full myriad of ways they can play? And that's the beauty of kind of zines as a source of local communities forming play practices or even recipes for making dowsing objects. And here, this is the cover of the sort of score that I'm working on right now. This is a project in process. If you want to go to the next slide. So in these scores, it's almost like graphic novel content spliced with recipes for objects. These objects I keep bringing up right here are from this page called the Near-Death Alphabet, in which it's actually a form of like psychomagical trauma processing, where you make play objects, a new alphabet, out of materials from a site in which you had a near-death experience. And there's a set of rules for harvesting the materials so that you can make them. These are all made out of a tree that almost crushed me to death in my sleep at the beginning of this year during the terrible storms that we had up here. It fell through my roof and it crushed down. And if I hadn't got out of bed a few minutes earlier, I could have been dead, you know. So whenever I encounter these experiences and I think about how and in what way a play can help me transform my experience, I'm also thinking about how I can then offer that as a set of rules to other people. So there's these rules for harvesting the materials, for tuning ourselves to this new alphabet, for transcribing these kinds of formal objects into even 2D spaces so we can begin using them as our own personal coding system. And then how and in what way we'll care for them and carry them with us and retune to them as we kind of go through the world, you know. So sometimes you'll have one page that's like a recipe for an object, and then let's go to the next page. And then sometimes you'll see here, this is like almost you're looking at a series of objects that have kind of lines and analytical diagrams connecting with them. There's an object, I see a mouse there. It's kind of like a linear object. You'll see, and this is that object. So a lot of the objects that appear in these scores also have recipes connected with them, because what is a recipe other than a set of instructions that you can follow to produce an experience? And an object is an experience, right? All objects came to be in our environment because of flows of time, the flux of matter, the flux of being. It's all kind of interconnected in that way. And we could go to the next slide and the next slide, and then we should do some questions before we run out of time here. But some of these get a little loosey-goosey in terms of like, wait, how am I supposed to interpret this? What's the order of operations here? And then going back to that idea of like a zine as a game, but there's no rules in it, but it's like these series of impressions that we're trying to connect through how we as a table, or we as a group, or me as the person who's going to lead someone through these weird experiences, is going to make sense out of this. And it might require a lot of different playful ways of shifting how we interpret what we see in order to take it as an instruction set and not just as a symbolic image. Okay, yeah, and there's some fun play with music notation. But yeah, so that's like covering this pretty wild span of like, what can a game text do? How can like even these images that we share like open up our minds as like scores for thought and play and practice? And would love to hear like any questions that have come up for folks, or I don't know if Sam, you want to jump back in here. Thanks for letting me go on my spiel there.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, and yeah, I think we're just ready for questions. Yeah, thank you, Patrick. That was great.
Sure.
Hi, I popped back in. It was super awesome to see both of your kind of parallel histories of zine-based games and also how you enter into those spaces. We have one question in the chat from Bartleby, which is, what is your favorite role-playing game? So I'll start by asking that of each of you.
Oh, do you want me to go first, Patrick?
Yeah.
I would say my favorite role-playing game, like honestly, like Thousand Islands is like darn close. I think a lot of my like art practice involves writing. I think that I think Patrick touched on this a lot of like language having rules, but what I think is really powerful about Thousand Islands is it doesn't have any rules beyond language and beyond visual art and how you would interpret them. I think that for me, I am most happy playing with role-playing games where the kind of like rules and the systems and the mechanisms and all those kind of video gamey engineering terms are not as important. And so there's a lot of other games like that that I like, but this is one I've shown and one that you can see. Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, I love, to me, how I approach, all of the games that kind of Sam talked about. I also love 1000 Islands for the amount of space that it offers the people who are playing to figure out how they want to connect these islands, basically. Thinking about like a little narrative or story offering as an island of content that's helping us create our own map of play. But what I will say is that my favorite role-playing game is existence itself. I think of avatarism as a way of life. I think of, how, I'll go to a coffee shop and just set up objects, on the table like this, and then I'll just set it there and I'll start kind of like working on something else, and someone will come up and be like, oh, what's that? And I'll be like, oh, it's a cloak for a puppet that hasn't been made yet. And what I'm showing right now is this sort of multicolored tapestry. It's like a small puppet cloak with arms, but then when you kind of contort it, it becomes a puppet itself. And then I can start kind of role-playing as this alternate identity within the context of a coffee shop, kind of adding this kind of space of kind of wild speculation into the mundane. So I see being aware of different play strategies in the experience of being alive, and being able to actually create bridges into those spaces of the imaginary in the social fabric of life is really my favorite game of all, because then is when you're really playing with expectations and embedding secrets. I love embedding secrets into common spaces and then making believe that I didn't know they were there. That's like a role play, and being like, surprised. That's something I kind of did when I engaged at the game lab, was, embedding all of these objects into the lab itself and then kind of revealing them in the course of a talk. And that was really fun. So I like kind of constructing and kind of homebrewing role-playing scenarios with the tools that I make. And so I know that might be a little inward facing. I love everything. I see all the books on my shelf. This one right here is it's just a compendium of all the gems by Melody. It's a compendium. All of her zines were compiled into this like Bible called Love is in the Earth. And all of her zines eventually got compiled into one giant tome where she just goes through all of the gems across the world and their metaphysical properties and spiritual properties. And she was just self-publishing this stuff with her own illustrations and things. And I see this as a role-playing, a system agnostic role-playing amendment. I'll flip through this for geological. If I'm playing even D&D, I'll like turn to this and be like, oh, what did someone find? And I'll do some bibliomancy, right? Like divination, where you flip through a book and be like, okay, oh, and celestite, you found a piece of celestite, right? And then the person will be like, oh, okay. But I like having this as like a game tool, right? Not unlike how the Thousand Islands are like game tools as well. So that's like a long sporadic answer, but role-playing games are literally embedded in everything around us. A dandelion is a game tool, if you blow the dandelion and where the things land, that becomes a game mechanic,
All right, I'm going to ask one question that could be a long answer, but I'll ask you to keep it quick because I know we're like running out of time, and I've got one more audience question I want to bring to you. But since I know that you both are teaching, and Patrick, right now you're teaching college students at UC Santa Cruz about play. Sam, I know you're at UCLA Games Lab, but you've done work with high schoolers through that. So I'll start with you, Sam. I just want to hear, in like your quickest distillation, what's a really enjoyable game experience or play-based experience that you do with your students or have done?
So I think maybe one that we've done is and it's actually like another good role-playing game that like people could check out, is this game called Parsley, where one person is basically pretending to be a text-based adventure. I think it fits into what Patrick is saying a lot about like kind of pretending that you're something else, and everyone else is trying to interact. Like sometimes whole groups of people are trying to interact with that person who's pretending to be the computer of a text-based adventure. But Patrick, you should share because you have more to say on this, I think.
Oh, I mean, one of my favorites, it's always very revelatory, and the students are always like, that's the game? Is this game that's called Rock Game or Game of Stones? And I give them this assignment. It's like, you must bring 2 rocks to class. Choose carefully. You must bring them back to where you got them from, after. And basically, it's this game. It's from a book called The Chairs Are Where the People Go, that's written by Sheila Heti and Misha Glauberman. And basically, it's this game where you get to witness how much complexity can emerge from an extremely simple set of rules. The game is played in silence. There's only 3 actions that each person can take on their turn that involve taking a rock from a basket, putting a rock back in a basket, or moving a rock that's already been taken out of the basket. And the game just continues in complete silence until all the rocks end up out of the basket. And we could play. I played it for 3-4 hours before, and it's always pretty a wild time. What happens in that,
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. I have one audience question that's kind of it's an awesome question, and I do want to get to it. We are at 5:30, so I'm going to take a moment right now and just tell folks about what is coming up next. In person, if you are in Sonoma County or can get here in an hour, we have a workshop with the artist Gio Benedetti, and he is going to be at the Rincon Valley Library branch from 6:30 to 7:30 tonight, doing a presentation called Your Creativity versus the Poop Monster. And he's made a comic just for this event. The poop monster is like your inner critic. When you have creativity wanting to burst out of you, and then there's a voice inside your head telling you that you suck. That's the poop monster. And Gio's going to help you with some exercises to overcome that. Tara on our library team is putting a feedback form in the chat, which we would love for you to click on so that when this is over, you can fill it out. If you want to stick around with us, we're going to go overtime a little bit to take this last question for Patrick. And we're just super thrilled to have had you all here today. You will get a copy of this video so you can share this conversation with other people or revisit it. There's a lot here to unpack. So Patrick, this comes from an anonymous attendee. Can you talk a bit about creating object recipes for serendipitous experience in the everyday world? Perhaps one is going out on an adventure and wants to find meaning in way of experiencing the strange or uncanny. What tips do you have for gathering the ingredients of the tools, and how might you use them imaginatively in the outside world to evoke the experience you desire?
This is such a great question. I think it really comes down to, that's the thing, is desire, right? Like sometimes when we think we know what we want, or we're trying to produce a specific effect, we can kind of like focus in on a particular way of doing something that is usually connected to the way we've done things before. And what it does, and it's a beautiful survival technique because it reduces a lot of noise and it helps us zero in on what we want and then go for that. I think my entire life, my whole practice and performative strategy has been to basically figure out, oh, what is it that I want? And then what is the most ridiculous way to go about doing that? Like, what is the least linear way to go about doing that? And knowing that I might not get what I want for 10 years if I go about it doing it this way, but all of these other things will emerge out of the woodwork. So here's kind of an example, is like going out into the world, saying like, how do I welcome the noise of what is here, right? How do I, so the other day I opened up the door and there was a banana slug on my doorstep. And then I just sat there for 10 minutes and was kind of like, oh my gosh, okay, so the banana slug is showing up today. That's like the dice roll. Instead of rolling a D20, I've opened my door and there's a new thing there. And instead of bypassing that new thing and saying oh, that's in my way, I don't want to step on it, it's on my doorstep, I got to get somewhere, that I'm cultivating a sense of oh, when something is even granularly different, I will take notice of it. If there's garbage in the gutter on my way to class that catches my eye, I might pick it up and then put it in my pocket. And then one of these strange totem objects, like this one right here, which has all these weird little things that screw on and little charms and things like that. This is one of the objects from Esgoinenkainen, and it has all these kind of appendages that connect. This is kind of emerged out of there being a windstorm in the middle of the night that blew all my windows open. And then I realized that I had a bunch of fake foliage on the roof that I didn't want to get blown into the natural habitat. So I went up there in the storm and started compiling all of the foliage off my roof. Now I think it's easier for me to cultivate noise in my life because I've been doing it. I put things in nonsensical places. I use uncommon sense. I deliberately think what's the most sensible way of doing this, and then what's the most loving and compassionate and interpersonally and ecologically aware way that I can do it in a way that actually inhibits me from getting what I desire, right? And then some new object usually kind of emerges out of that. A new kind of technique emerges out of that. A new character emerges out of that. And they're all kind of bubbling, in a kind of a cauldron. So how would you go about doing that? Is I think start paying attention to the things you would normally ignore. Try to figure out, wake up tomorrow and when you go outside, think what is all this stuff about where I am and what's happening that I would normally ignore? And then write even one sentence about it, or pick up a stick on your way somewhere. Choose to believe that stick is important. Bring that stick into your life. Think about how you could use it. Show it to someone else and say, I found this today and I'm not sure what it is, right? Choose to deliberately forget what we think we know. Cultivate a lack of sense, a lack of knowing. undo the taxonomies and allow things to kind of like become something else. Because when we're at the tabletop role-playing game table, a stick isn't just a stick. A stick could be a wall. A stick could be a character. A stick could be a tool for inciting discussion, right? Like when I bring a stick up here, this is no longer just a stick. Now it's a totem object that I'm using to prove a point. And sometimes even it could be like a dancer or a puppet. So these are things that I like to play. Is different than game. It's about widening what's possible in the space of game, right? Players push at the rules. They try to challenge them through the way we express ourselves within them. And playing with the structures of your own life, choosing different paths, walking different ways, becoming a character. That's why I offer these Fluxus scores, is because those can be starting points for thinking about what we take for granted and how we live.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone who stuck around with us. It's been wonderful to hear from Sam and Patrick. I know this conversation could go on forever, but we're hoping that by stopping it here, it leaves space for you to think and innovate and create from what you heard today. We have an awesome lineup. I only told you about what's coming up next, but we have other online presentations to check out on our website. Tomorrow we have a really rad conversation at the same time, 4:30 p.m. That is going to be called We Keep Us Healthy, and it will be folks from marginalized communities talking about how those communities use zines to share information that isn't necessarily available in our healthcare system about how we can care for one another and our communities and ourselves. So that's up next. We have 2 presentations in Spanish, one in person at Roseland on Wednesday, one online on Friday with Yesenia Moya Garay. And then our big zine fair on Saturday. We have a zine social at Brew. We have an at capacity event on letterpress at North Bay Letterpress Arts. I'm going to bring Tara back on to tell you anything I forgot. So we'll welcome Tara back, but thanks again to our fantastic panelists for shedding a light on some of the things we maybe haven't thought about that zines can be.
Awesome. Thank you, Chelsea. And thank you so much, Patrick and Sam. That was amazing. And that wraps up our first event of Santa Rosa Zine Fest 2023. So as Chelsea mentioned, we do have another event today at 6:30. So we hope to see some of you in person at the Rincon Valley Library at 6:30 and for our other events throughout the week as well. And we did drop a short survey in the chat for feedback. So we'd love it if you could let us know what you thought about this workshop and about our other programs throughout the week so that we can adjust to make them even better next year. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you at the other events. Bye.